Pause for a moment and look at your life as if you were standing outside of it. Strip away the emotion and just observe the patterns, the way your mornings begin, the habits that guide your decisions, the quiet repetition of days that feel different but lead to the same place. Everything seems stable, even intentional, but beneath that surface is something most people never question. Patterns that feel like identity may have formed without your awareness, shaping your choices long before you consciously decide. The Stoics warned that the greatest loss isn't failure, it's unconscious living, not noticing what shapes your actions, your focus, your direction. When something feels familiar, it stops being examined, and once it stops being examined, it quietly starts to guide you. Most people never see it. They remain in lives that feel normal, defending routines that were never truly chosen, not because they are weak, but because habit is invisible until awareness intervenes. Even sensing that something feels off is a sign that awareness is stirring. That resistance, however small, is a recognition that you are not entirely passive. The path forward is not about forcing change immediately, but about observing clearly, understanding deeply, and beginning to question what has been accepted. Each moment of clarity strengthens perception and opens the possibility of acting with intention rather than drifting along familiar, unexamined patterns. What most people call an average life doesn't form by accident. It feels ordinary, almost natural, but that sense of normality is built quietly, layer by layer, through repetition that often goes unnoticed. You wake at roughly the same time, follow familiar routines, think in ways that feel automatic, and react in patterns that no longer require effort. None of it feels imposed. That's what makes it so effective. It doesn't demand your attention, so it rarely gets questioned. Over time, these repeated behaviors stop feeling like actions you perform and start feeling like something you are. Once something feels like identity, it becomes harder to challenge, harder to change. You defend it rather than examine it. There's a subtle shift that happens when awareness fades. At first, you are choosing. You are deciding, adjusting, thinking through your actions. But repetition simplifies everything. It reduces the need for reflection. What once required effort and thought becomes automatic. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." Each repeated thought shapes the mind, and each repeated reaction shapes the self. Unchecked, these patterns operate quietly, guiding your life while giving the illusion that you are still in control. And if this structure exists, it didn't appear out of nowhere. It formed gradually, shaped by influences that rarely announce themselves. The rules guiding your behavior, the boundaries you rarely cross, the quiet assumptions about what is realistic or possible. Most of these were never consciously selected. They were absorbed, picked up through observation, repetition, and subtle reinforcement from the world around you. No one explained them as laws, yet they function with the same authority. They define what feels possible before you even actively consider your options. Epictetus once said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." Many people reverse the order. They act first, repeatedly, and then allow those repeated actions to define who they are. Identity forms through accumulation, and once it forms, it begins to limit what feels possible. Small choices become habitual, habits become patterns, and patterns eventually feel fixed. You stop stepping outside certain behaviors not because you cannot, but because it feels contradictory to who you believe yourself to be. Familiarity has quiet authority. It convinces you that repetition is correct, or at least acceptable. And when curiosity is suppressed, disruption is rare. Without questioning, the current continues, carrying you along, even if the direction was never chosen. Look closely at your time, and you'll see how subtly it slips away. It doesn't disappear all at once. It fragments. Small distractions, constant interruptions, Moments that feel insignificant on their own accumulate into something larger. Attention is the medium through which life is directed. Carl Jung once reflected, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When attention is scattered, life is shaped for you rather than by you. Notifications, endless streams of content, trivial obligations, they fragment focus and fragment potential. When your focus drifts, your direction does too. And then there is your environment. Not just the physical space you occupy, but the mental space you inhabit. Conversations, behaviors, standards you observe every day, they are not neutral. What feels easy or safe discourages friction, and friction is the fuel for growth. Without challenge, stability becomes stagnation, and growth begins to feel unnecessary. Identity becomes fixed, and once it is fixed, behavior follows predictably. Approval begins to dictate choices. You adjust your actions to fit expectations without realizing it. When decisions are guided by how they will be received, rather than necessity or principle, autonomy diminishes. The patterns of distraction, expectation, comfort, and identity all converge, quietly shaping a life that feels normal while limiting the possible. And here is where everything connects. The invisible rules, the fragmented attention, the environment, the comfort, the identity, the need for approval, they reinforce each other consistently. Not aggressively, but persistently. And persistence makes them powerful. The Stoics believed that freedom begins with perception, seeing things as they truly are, not as they appear. Once the structure behind behavior is seen, something rare emerges: choice. Not theoretical choice, but practical control over what you repeat, what you accept, and what you change. Interruption of unconscious patterns is the gateway to autonomy. It is what separates the majority who drift from the few who act with intention. And here is the quiet truth. Awareness alone is not enough. Choice demands action. You can recognize the currents shaping your life, or you can let them carry you along. Epictetus reminds us that living deliberately is not abstract. It is applied, repeated, and tested in small daily decisions. Each moment reclaimed from pattern is a moment of freedom earned. And this is where your journey continues, beyond observation, toward active shaping of your life. If you feel the pull to continue observing, questioning, and refining how you live, then subscribing is more than a click. It's a conscious step toward understanding, a commitment to seeing clearly and acting deliberately to keep refining what you repeat, what you accept, and what you change in your own life. This is where perception begins to blur with reality. A limitation repeated enough times begins to feel like a fact. Not because it has been tested, but because it has been accepted without resistance. The Stoics were precise about this distinction. They argued that many of the barriers people experience are not external constraints, but internal judgments that have gone unexamined. What makes this more subtle is that these judgments rarely feel imposed. They feel reasonable, sensible, even protective. You tell yourself certain paths are too risky, certain goals too unrealistic, certain changes too disruptive. But those conclusions are often formed long before you actually test them. They are conclusions inherited from patterns you observed growing up, from reactions you received, from environments that shaped your sense of what is acceptable. Over time, these ideas settle into your thinking so deeply that they no longer feel like ideas at all. They feel like truth. And once something feels like truth, it doesn't need to be questioned. It simply guides behavior automatically. You hesitate without fully understanding why. You avoid certain actions without consciously deciding to. You filter your choices through a set of invisible criteria that you didn't design, but now enforce. This is where the structure becomes self-sustaining. It no longer requires external pressure because it has been internalized. The boundaries are no longer outside of you. They are part of how you think. Seneca once wrote, We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. It's an observation that cuts deeper than it appears. Much of what holds people back isn't what actually happens when they act, but what they believe will happen before they act. The imagined outcome becomes more influential than reality itself, and when imagination is shaped by repeated judgments, it reinforces the same limits over and over again. You don't test the boundary because the mind has already decided what lies beyond it. This is how hesitation becomes consistent. Not because of inability, but because of prejudgment. You begin to interpret possibilities through a lens that has been shaped over time. You don't evaluate each situation fresh. You apply existing assumptions, and those assumptions narrow your range of action before you even begin. It feels like you are making decisions freely, but the options you consider are already filtered. The structure is subtle, but it is precise. What makes this even more difficult to recognize is that these internal rules often align with what is socially reinforced. The expectations you absorbed are usually shared by others around you. That shared perspective strengthens them. It makes them feel validated, confirmed, and therefore unquestionable. When everyone operates within similar boundaries, those boundaries begin to feel natural, not restrictive, but normal, and what feels normal rarely gets examined closely. Over time, this creates a kind of mental environment where deviation feels uncomfortable, not because it is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. The mind prefers consistency. It prefers what it recognizes. So it resists stepping outside of established patterns, even when those patterns are limiting. That resistance doesn't feel like fear in an obvious sense. It feels like caution, like logic, like making the right decision. But beneath that surface is a deeper mechanism at work, one that prioritizes familiarity over possibility. This is where awareness becomes critical, not as a vague concept, but as a deliberate act of observation. You begin to notice when a thought arises that limits your action. You examine where it came from. You question whether it is based on evidence or repetition. And in that moment, something shifts. The thought loses some of its authority. It stops being an unquestioned truth and becomes something you can evaluate. That evaluation is where control begins to return. Not complete control, not immediate freedom, but a gradual reclaiming of your decision-making process. You start to see that many of the boundaries you've accepted were never tested. They were assumed. And assumptions, when examined, often reveal themselves to be far less solid than they appeared. The question then becomes more precise. Not whether you are capable, but whether you are operating within limits that were never truly yours. Each decision you make either reinforces those limits or challenges them. Each hesitation either confirms the pattern or interrupts it, and over time, those small moments of awareness begin to accumulate, just as the patterns did before. The structure doesn't disappear instantly. It has been built through repetition, and it will resist change in the same way. But once you see it clearly, it can no longer operate invisibly. You begin to recognize the difference between what is actually in front of you and what has been projected onto it by past conditioning. That distinction is subtle, but it changes how you move. Because once you realize that many of your decisions are shaped before you consciously make them, you start to approach them differently. You slow down, you question, you create space between impulse and action, and in that space, something new becomes possible. Not because the world has changed, but because your perception of it has. And that is where the deeper shift begins, not in forcing yourself to act differently, but in seeing clearly enough that acting differently becomes the natural response. Look closely at your time, and you'll see how quietly it slips away. It doesn't vanish in a dramatic moment, and there is rarely a single event that marks its loss. Instead, it fragments, breaking into pieces so small that each one seems harmless. A few minutes spent scrolling, a moment lost to an unimportant notification, a conversation that doesn't advance your thinking. These fragments accumulate without notice until they form a river that carries your day along without your active direction. On its own, each fragment appears trivial, but over weeks, months, and years, the collection becomes defining. The Stoics understood this subtle power. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." That reminder, though stark, frames every moment of attention as something precious. Each choice of focus is an opportunity to live deliberately, and yet, without conscious awareness, that choice is ceded to the smallest pulls of habit and environment. When attention is divided, life's direction becomes fragmented too. Every interruption reshapes priorities whether you notice it or not. A mind pulled in 10 directions cannot pursue any one thing with depth. The Stoics emphasized that where the mind goes, the self follows, and where the self follows, life takes shape. If focus is constantly diverted, what emerges is a life designed by external forces rather than internal intention. Epictetus once observed, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Freedom, in this sense, is less about external circumstances and more about the careful governance of attention. When your focus drifts toward what is trivial, time itself becomes the controlling influence, and the potential for consistent progress fades quietly. You begin to measure accomplishment in fragments, in the illusion of busyness rather than in meaningful achievement. The cost is subtle but profound, because attention is the medium through which life itself is directed. This fragmentation does not usually appear threatening. In fact, it feels normal. Checking notifications, skimming content, shifting from one minor task to another, these behaviors appear practical, convenient, even necessary. Yet they form patterns that consolidate slowly, shaping how your mind evaluates what matters. Each small diversion trains the mind to accept disruption as a constant state. It conditions the self to respond reactively rather than to initiate. And this reactive state becomes a default over time, quietly limiting the capacity to sustain effort and make deliberate choices. Seneca once wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." The phrasing is deliberate. It is not the quantity of hours that defines life, but the quality and focus with which they are used. Wasted attention is the slow erosion of autonomy, and unnoticed repetition is the most effective agent of that loss. Time, when treated in fragments, becomes both endless and insufficient. You feel busy, yet the accumulation of activity produces little in terms of meaningful outcomes. You move, yet progress appears stalled. The mind, divided across distractions, struggles to maintain continuity. Without continuity, vision falters, and purpose begins to feel optional. Attention becomes a commodity, traded for engagement rather than creation. Carl Jung once reflected, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." The process of looking inward, of observing how time and attention are allocated, is a moment of awakening. It reveals the invisible patterns that guide behavior and demonstrates how easily focus can be surrendered without conscious intent. The subtle power of distraction lies in its invisibility. It does not announce itself, nor does it confront you aggressively. Instead, it builds a landscape of micro-decisions, where attention is incrementally surrendered. The system that manages this is not external. It lives within your habits, routines, and impulses. Each small choice to give attention away, though seemingly insignificant, reinforces the system. It trains the mind to accept fragmentation as the norm. When this pattern is internalized, stability and direction are no longer products of deliberate action, but of inertia. Every repeated moment of diversion solidifies a path that feels natural, familiar, even reasonable, yet carries you steadily away from intentionality. Reclaiming focus requires more than temporary discipline. It requires recognition of the patterns themselves. Discomfort accompanies this realization because the mind has grown accustomed to the scattered rhythm of distraction. To redirect attention is to confront the habitual friction that has been quietly tolerated. Each interruption you resist, each fragment of time you reclaim, contributes to a restructuring of experience. Aristotle once noted, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Excellence, in the context of attention, emerges not from sporadic bursts of focus, but from repeated, deliberate allocation of energy toward meaningful ends. Habitual mindfulness over where attention rests reshapes how time itself is experienced, gradually transforming fragmented hours into coherent momentum. A practical implication of this principle is that attention must be protected deliberately. It is not sufficient to simply intend to focus. The environment, routines, and mental states that invite distraction must be evaluated and, when necessary, altered. External stimuli have a disproportionate effect on internal states, especially when attention is untrained. The invisible force of distraction does not need to impose itself actively when it can insinuate itself silently into daily practice. Epictetus's counsel reinforces this. Keep yourself in a state where you can direct your own life, for what belongs to others is beyond control. Directing life begins with managing attention consistently, not sporadically. Each choice to preserve focus is a step toward reclaiming authorship over time and intention. Over time, fragmented attention shapes perception itself. What seems urgent but trivial dominates experience, while important but demanding objectives fade into neglect. This conditioning reinforces the perception that life is crowded, chaotic, and reactive, rather than structured, deliberate, and meaningful. Even small reallocations of attention can generate disproportionate effects. Mindfulness becomes a stabilizing force, a way to regain influence over the flow of time and the quality of action. Marcus Aurelius once advised, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one." Applied to attention, this becomes a call to action. Do not merely recognize the distractions, act intentionally to align attention with what matters. The cumulative impact of reclaiming focus is profound. Attention, once directed consistently, magnifies productivity, clarity, and purpose. Each day structured around deliberate focus reinforces the self as an agent rather than a passive observer of circumstance. The Stoic perspective emphasizes that while external events remain beyond control, the allocation of attention is fully within it. By recognizing fragmentation, interrupting habitual diversion, and prioritizing meaningful engagement, a coherent life path emerges from the scattered pieces. By observing, interrupting, and redirecting attention, the subtle architecture of time becomes visible. Patterns of distraction, once imperceptible, reveal their influence over behavior, perception, and outcome. Consistent focus is not merely a tool for efficiency, but a form of self-mastery, a reclaiming of authority over the unfolding of experience. As attention stabilizes, so too does direction, purpose, and the capacity for meaningful action. The fragmented moments, once tolerated passively, are replaced with deliberate engagement, creating a life shaped by intention rather than by the quiet persistence of habit. Each moment reclaimed becomes a building block for a coherent existence, demonstrating the Stoic truth that mastery over the self begins with mastery over where one places their attention. Now consider your environment, not only the physical space you occupy, but the mental landscape in which your thoughts are immersed. It includes the conversations you hear, the standards you observe, and the behaviors modeled by those around you. These influences are not passive, they are active agents shaping perception and expectation. What becomes familiar often begins to feel natural, and when something feels natural, it is rarely questioned. The Stoics were profoundly aware of this, emphasizing the careful selection of associations because repeated exposure molds character and thinking. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been." Though framed around harm, the underlying principle applies broadly. The environment we allow ourselves to inhabit determines what is internalized. If we are surrounded by narrow perspectives, by limits presented as inevitabilities, we start to absorb them unconsciously. Over time, the boundaries we initially observed externally become internalized, shaping decisions and perceptions without our explicit consent. It is astonishing how subtle the influence can be. A casual remark that passes without significance, repeated over time, can solidify into an invisible rule. A standard observed quietly in day-to-day interactions can set the bar for what feels acceptable or possible. Seneca once wrote, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality." In the context of environment, this idea manifests in a quiet kind of conditioning. We become limited not because the world actively restrains us, but because what surrounds us creates an unconscious narrative about where our abilities and boundaries lie. It is easy to mistake these inherited limits for personal choice, to believe that what we accept is authentic rather than absorbed. Each repeated exposure strengthens that narrative, creating an invisible scaffold upon which identity and expectation are built. Without active awareness, you may never realize that your perceived limits were modeled before they were chosen, taught before they were tested. These influences are cumulative, operating beneath the surface in ways that can feel entirely natural. A pattern observed in others can lead to imitation, which eventually becomes habit. Standards quietly endorsed by those around you shape what is reinforced or discouraged in your own behavior. Each unexamined reaction to your surroundings strengthens the norms you unconsciously adopt. Each time you mimic behaviors or comply with expectations without reflection, you are reinforcing those structures internally. Over time, the mind adapts to this reinforced reality, treating limitations as self-imposed rather than externally influenced, while the perception of freedom remains intact. The subtlety of this process makes it particularly dangerous because it operates quietly, slowly, and without obvious signs of coercion. Physical surroundings are only a portion of the story. Mental and emotional environments exert comparable influence. The narratives you are exposed to, the attitudes prevalent in your social circles, and the unspoken rules communicated through culture and routine, all of these inform perception. Without conscious reflection, you may internalize a worldview that seems like your own, but is, in fact, a product of repeated observation and imitation. The unconscious absorbs the limits presented by others, and these become the framework within which decisions are filtered. Even subtle alignment has consequences. If everyone around you operates within a confined range of ambition or expectation, those boundaries begin to feel reasonable. Over time, deviation becomes uncomfortable. What feels natural is no longer a neutral baseline, it becomes a ceiling. Socrates once emphasized, "The unexamined life is not worth living," and in the context of environment, the unexamined influences are particularly insidious. Accepting norms without reflection allows external pressures to define internal standards. The mind adopts these standards as if they were personal insights, while in reality they are borrowed, imposed, and reinforced by repetition. Without awareness, the space for curiosity, exploration, and growth gradually diminishes. Mental and physical surroundings converge to shape identity, perception, and choice, often without explicit notice. That quiet shaping can produce a life that feels self-directed while remaining tightly guided by external influence. The process is gradual, almost imperceptible. It is the repeated observation of limitations, the subtle reinforcement of habits, and the quiet approval of conformity that slowly embeds itself into cognition. Repetition is the mechanism through which environmental influence is converted into internal architecture. Even seemingly positive surroundings can impose limits. Supportive individuals, though encouraging, often operate within familiar boundaries themselves. They may inadvertently signal where caution is advisable, where effort is acceptable, and where ambition should be measured. The subtle cues communicated by admiration, approval, or social harmony function as invisible constraints. Seneca observed, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you." The emphasis is on deliberate selection. Awareness of influence is crucial because even well-meaning guidance can anchor thinking. Surrounding yourself passively, without assessment of the implicit messages transmitted, allows these norms to integrate quietly into the self. Eventually, your cognitive environment can guide choices as effectively as any explicit directive, yet without your conscious consent. Each internalized expectation limits what seems feasible, narrowing the horizon without overt restriction. A final dimension is the temporal effect of environmental influence. Exposure accumulates over time, gradually shaping habits, preferences, and priorities. What feels instinctive is often the product of repeated interaction with surrounding norms. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Be like the cliff against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it." The cliff is the self that maintains integrity against the surrounding currents. Recognizing environmental influence is akin to stepping into the role of the cliff, observing which currents shape thought and which can be resisted. Each conscious adjustment reinforces autonomy and interrupts the unconscious adoption of external norms. The process is neither immediate nor dramatic, but the cumulative effect reorients perception, decision-making, and identity. Over time, the environment transforms from invisible controller to a consciously navigated context, restoring the capacity to act in alignment with chosen principles rather than inherited expectations. This layered awareness of conversations, behaviors, standards, and subtle approvals reveals the degree to which our mental and physical surroundings dictate what we perceive as normal. The environment is neither inherently good nor bad, but its power emerges through repetition and unexamined compliance. Each interaction, each absorbed expectation, each modeled behavior quietly reinforces the structure that defines perceived limits. By cultivating observation, reflection, and deliberate selection of associations, it becomes possible to reclaim authorship over perception. The Stoics taught that the individual is not powerless before external circumstances. Rather, through awareness and intentional alignment, influence can be recognized, assessed, and integrated consciously. It is the conscious observer within the environment who transforms passive exposure into deliberate cultivation, shaping identity and action with clarity, purpose, and measured intent. Comfort is a quiet architect of limitation. It feels earned, safe, and familiar. It creates the illusion of stability, wrapping life in a sense of achievement that doesn't demand reflection. In this state, you may convince yourself that all is well, that the absence of struggle signals success. Yet the Stoics were cautious of this very trap. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Comfort, when left unexamined, removes those impediments, leaving no friction to provoke growth. Without challenge, the mind softens, habituated to ease. Stability, as it feels in the moment, is not the same as resilience. The absence of difficulty does not cultivate strength. It conceals weakness beneath the guise of security. The danger of comfort is that it slowly narrows perception. When everything around you is familiar and undemanding, your internal bar for effort diminishes. Tasks that once required focus now feel trivial, and tasks that once seemed manageable may start to feel threatening, simply because the mind has adapted to minimal resistance. Seneca once observed, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor." Here, poverty is not material but psychological. Dependence on ease impoverishes the capacity to endure, adapt, and create. When discomfort is avoided, the ability to meet challenges declines quietly, almost imperceptibly. Each instance of choosing comfort reinforces a pattern of avoidance, and over time, the mind associates effort with risk and disruption rather than opportunity. Growth, by contrast, is forged in friction. Every obstacle navigated, every task that stretches capacity, every deliberate choice to step beyond the familiar builds a structure of resilience that comfort cannot provide. The Stoics understood this principle deeply. Epictetus once said, "Difficulties are things that show a person what they are." The value of discomfort is not abstract. It is measurable in the expansion of capability, the strengthening of discipline, and the deepening of awareness. Without challenge, the self remains static. Stability in isolation is illusory. It is a plateau that hides erosion, a space where skills, focus, and resolve quietly atrophy. Comfort, therefore, is not inherently negative, but dependence upon it is a slow constriction of potential, a subtle retreat from the possibility of meaningful growth. Even supportive conditions can perpetuate limitation. Social expectations, cultural norms, and habitual indulgences reinforce the ease of life, signaling that deviation is unnecessary, that discomfort is optional. This messaging conditions the mind to prefer the familiar over the productive. Each small decision to avoid effort, to maintain ease, consolidates the framework of comfort, and over time, the framework gains authority over choice. Carl Jung once remarked, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But becoming requires movement, friction, and resistance. Without the tension between effort and ease, the self cannot stretch beyond inherited or comfortable boundaries. Comfort, left unexamined, can become an invisible cage, and the mind, lulled by familiarity, ceases to perceive its own limits. What is most insidious is that comfort doesn't alarm the senses. It doesn't provoke anxiety or urgency. Instead, it soothes, reassures, and seduces the mind into compliance. It masks inertia as satisfaction, inactivity as stability. The danger is not always obvious because it doesn't announce itself. The habit of ease is cumulative, built through repetition of choices that appear trivial at first. Over months and years, this quiet accumulation creates a rigidity that is mistaken for stability, and a life measured in comfort becomes resistant to adaptation. The Stoics recognized the subtlety of such entrenchment. Marcus Aurelius observed, "You are a little soul carrying around a corpse, as if your life depended on comfort instead of reason." The quote emphasizes that comfort can detach the mind from engagement with reality, making ease a substitute for deliberate action. The psychological mechanics behind comfort are compelling. Ease triggers reward systems, creating reinforcement loops that reduce the perceived value of challenge. Cognitive and emotional patterns adapt to low friction, and effort itself begins to feel unnatural. Activities requiring sustained focus, delayed gratification, or complex problem-solving become sources of stress rather than opportunity. Seneca captured this dynamic when he said, "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials." Growth is inseparable from challenge. The very elements that discomfort us are the instruments of refinement. Avoiding them may feel protective, but it ultimately diminishes capability and awareness. Dependence on comfort thus undermines the Stoic pursuit of virtue and self-mastery, replacing active engagement with passive stability. Moreover, comfort shapes perception of risk. When the mind becomes habituated to ease, even minor obstacles begin to feel threatening. The absence of regular challenge distorts the assessment of effort and danger, making everyday resistance appear insurmountable. In this sense, comfort creates a psychological narrowing of experience. Epictetus emphasized, "No great thing is created suddenly. The cultivation of strength, endurance, and skill depends on sustained engagement with difficulty. If comfort is allowed to dominate, the incremental, necessary encounters with challenge are avoided, and the mind loses both practice and confidence in its own capacity. Over time, a life dominated by comfort can feel static, and yet the stagnation is invisible to those within it. Resisting comfort does not require chaos, deprivation, or unnecessary suffering. The goal is deliberate engagement, not self-imposed misery. Choosing tasks that require effort, pursuing challenges that stretch capacity, and embracing discomfort as a teacher are sufficient to maintain growth. When applied to comfort, this suggests that deliberate practices of tension and resistance become the building blocks of character. The repeated choice to confront difficulty, whether intellectual, emotional, or physical, reshapes the mind and strengthens resilience. It aligns experience with potential, preventing the subtle atrophy that arises from passive ease. Finally, comfort is a mirror. It reflects not only the environment, but also the inner state of the self. How easily we settle into ease reveals our attachment to security over growth, predictability over capability, and familiarity over possibility. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." Applied to comfort, this is a call to awareness. Life is finite, and ease without engagement wastes the potential inherent in each moment. By embracing challenge as an instrument of development, friction as a tool rather than an obstacle, the mind maintains vitality and agency. Comfort, unexamined, may lull the self into stagnation, but through conscious confrontation of ease, deliberate effort, and consistent engagement with difficulty, growth continues, resilience strengthens, and the self evolves in alignment with both principle and potential. Identity is often presented as fixed, a solid and unchangeable element of who we are, yet this is largely an illusion. The habits we repeat, the choices we avoid, the patterns we inherit from upbringing, culture, and environment, they accumulate over time to form what feels like an immutable self. From a distance, it appears as a seamless integration of traits, tendencies, and behaviors, but up close, it is a tapestry woven from repetition rather than a product of conscious design. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You are a little soul carrying around a corpse," a stark observation highlighting that much of what we carry as self is preordained by unexamined patterns. The body, the mind, and the assumptions within us all contribute to this sense of continuity, yet the cohesion is often mistaken for authenticity. The Stoics cautioned that identity is not inherited but chosen, and that awareness of this distinction is the first step towards self-mastery. Our present actions define our identity more than our past habits. Yet, in daily life, few operate this way consciously. Most cling to a self-image constructed from repetition, defending it as though it were natural or divinely ordained. There is comfort in this continuity. Protecting an identity that has become familiar reduces uncertainty. It shields the mind from the cognitive and emotional labor required to interrogate why one behaves in certain ways. Seneca once wrote, "Every man is ashamed of the testimony of his own conscience," a reminder that the inner observer is often uncomfortable with scrutiny. Confronting the arbitrary origins of our identity can provoke unease because it reveals that much of what we believe about ourselves is adopted, not chosen. People compensate for this unease by reaffirming identity through repeated behaviors, reinforcing the very patterns they might unconsciously question. This process creates a cycle. Behaviors define identity, and identity justifies behaviors. The mind interprets consistency as truth. Deviating from entrenched patterns feels like contradiction or failure, even when the deviation aligns with reason and growth. Epictetus advised, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Applied to identity, the principle reveals that freedom is not in external validation, but in the conscious selection of responses. Each habitual choice, each avoidance or compliance, embeds further into the sense of self, constructing boundaries that seem inviolable. And yet, if these boundaries originate from repetition rather than deliberate intent, they may limit potential rather than protect it. What feels like integrity may actually be adherence to unconscious programming. Consider the narratives we tell ourselves. I'm just not that kind of person, or this is how I am. These statements are not neutral. They are declarative affirmations that fix the self within predefined contours. Identity constructed from unexamined habits functions in the same way. Unconscious patterns guide behavior, yet the mind interprets the outcomes as evidence of a stable self. Repetition reinforces predictability, and predictability is mistaken for authenticity. Each action that aligns with this constructed identity is celebrated internally, further embedding the patterns and diminishing the perceived need for reflection. Over time, these patterns crystallize, producing a self that feels continuous, coherent, and unassailable. This makes deviation from identity psychologically uncomfortable. Choices that challenge inherited patterns provoke cognitive dissonance because they contradict the existing self-image. The familiar becomes a standard by which actions are evaluated, often discouraging innovation, courage, or exploration. Identity thus functions as both shield and limitation. Plato once wrote, "The first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself," signaling that the struggle against preordained identity is essential for genuine autonomy. Without the willingness to question who we are, behaviors repeat uncritically, and the scope of our actions narrows, often without notice. Habits that were never questioned become principles, and principles without examination become invisible chains. The danger of unexamined identity is that it frames choice in terms of self-consistency rather than purpose or virtue. When the self is interpreted as fixed, even adaptive actions are filtered through a lens of maintaining consistency. Effort is often measured not by its alignment with goals or values, but by its conformity to prior behaviors. Habits, however, must be chosen deliberately to cultivate excellence. When habits are unconsciously inherited, excellence is replaced by conformity, and the mind becomes both rigid and predictable. The repetition that constructs identity without oversight establishes a psychological inertia that resists adaptation and growth. Examining identity requires courage because it confronts the familiar and challenges the comforting narrative that has been maintained. To step outside the patterns you have internalized is to destabilize the self temporarily, a process that can provoke anxiety and doubt. Yet within that discomfort lies opportunity. The deliberate act of defining identity from principles rather than inherited behaviors interrupts unconscious repetition. This reorientation allows action to align with reason and intention rather than mere habit, and it gradually reshapes perception of what is possible. Each choice becomes a statement of authorship, each deliberate behavior a reinforcement of a consciously constructed self. Moreover, identity is not solely internal, it is relational. How you perceive yourself is influenced by interactions, social contexts, and cultural norms. Acceptance, approval, and critique from others interact with internalized patterns to reinforce existing self-concepts. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will gladly change, for I seek the truth by which no one was ever truly harmed." A self that clings rigidly to inherited patterns resists truth because change requires acknowledgement that past choices were not inevitably correct. Each moment of openness to reflection is an opportunity to realign identity with principles rather than defaults, to disassemble patterns that no longer serve and reconstruct them with conscious intent. Over time, the continuous reinforcement of habitual identity produces a feedback loop. Thoughts, actions, and self-perception coalesce into a self-concept that resists external influence and internal insight alike. This can create a sense of security, but the security is illusory. Misery here is subtle. It is the stagnation of potential masked as continuity, the slow narrowing of choice justified by the mantra of "this is who I am." The mind interprets limitation as authenticity, comfort as stability, and repetition as validation. Only through conscious observation and deliberate disruption of these patterns does the self regain flexibility, perspective, and the capacity for growth. Identity is ultimately a living construct. Its form is determined not by past repetition alone, but by present choices actively made with awareness. By examining inherited patterns, questioning automatic behaviors, and aligning actions with deliberate principles, the mind can transform a static, reinforced self into a dynamic, autonomous agent. Identity, once scrutinized and consciously shaped, ceases to be a passive inheritance and becomes an active, responsive creation, continuously aligned with reason, principle, and purpose. Remember, clarity is nothing without action. Seeing the patterns that shape your life is the first step, but the true transformation comes when you step deliberately into what is uncomfortable, what challenges you, and what expands your capacity. You have the ability to reclaim your attention, your choices, and your direction. The structures that once controlled you can now serve you if you act with intention. Keep observing, keep questioning, and keep choosing. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal and committing to awareness, reflection, and growth. If you want to continue exploring these ideas and deepen your practice, watch one of the suggested videos on the screen. Let each one guide you further along the path of deliberate living and meaningful action.